Welcome to Transformed by Grace, an in-depth Bible study of God's Word, presented by the Berean Bible Society. Join us each time on this station as Pastor Kevin brings the transforming message of God's grace, revealed through the Holy Scriptures.
The following are some examples of irony. In 1990, after 35 years working at Crayola, their retiring CEO, Emerson Moser, revealed that he was colorblind. A man named Bill Hillman wrote a book called How to Survive the Bulls of Pamplona. Despite his book being all about how to not be killed by bulls, he died 3 weeks after the book was released, killed by a bull. In 2009, the Guinness Book of World Records named Jonathan Lee Riches the record holder for suing the largest number of people, angrily declaring that the Guinness Book has no right to publish my work, my legal masterpieces. He sued them. Just before being shot and killed, the governor of Texas's wife said to John F. Kennedy, "Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you." Q-tips, which are usually bought primarily to clean inside your ears, are sold in boxes that expressly warn, do not insert inside the ear canal. In 2011, the winners of an elementary school spelling bee in Utah received a trophy reading Vermont Spelling Bee, first place with the word spelling misspelled. And the most shoplifted book in America is the Bible. Another example of irony is the demise of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, which we will examine in this message. Esther 7, 1-4 reads, "So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage." Haman had attended a private banquet with the king and queen the day before. At that banquet, Queen Esther asked that the king and Haman attend a second banquet the next day where she would make a request to the king. This is what the king's chamberlains came to Haman's house to escort him to. Haman went to the banquet with mingled feelings. He was still mortified at the honor given to Mordecai and his part in it, while also proud to be invited to the second banquet. Verse 1 of chapter 7 tells us that both the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther as she had requested. And once again, it's just the three of them, King Ahasuerus, Queen Esther, and Haman. We find the drama heightened at this point in the story. The plot has been filled thus far with guile and danger, reluctance, and bravery. Haman did not know of the connection between Mordecai and Esther, and it's important to remember that neither the king nor Haman knew yet that Esther was a Jewess. As Esther 2:10 states, Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred, for Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Esther was in a dangerous position, and she was about to identify herself with a minority group that Haman had represented to the king as subversive and problematic for his kingdom. And now she was about to accuse his closest advisor of being an enemy and a villain. If the king was angered at finding out that she was a Jew, or if he sided with Haman instead of her, we know he could have had her dethroned and banished, as he had done with Queen Vashti, or he could have had her executed with just a word. Verse 2 tells us that during the second day's banquet at the banquet of wine, or after the meal and at the time of the banquet when the wine was served. Like at the first banquet at this time, the king asked Esther what her petition and request was. King Ahasuerus again assured her and told of his willingness to grant and perform whatever she desired, even up to half of the vast Persian kingdom, which simply meant that he would be generous with whatever her request was. This is the third time the king asked her what her petition was. He was having trouble getting a straight answer out of Esther. The king asked her what her petition was when she first approached him in the throne room, but she simply asked him to attend a banquet she had prepared. Then he asked her what her request was at the first banquet, but sensing the time wasn't right and also by God's leading, Esther wisely held back and delayed, but promised to answer him at this second banquet. And Esther kept her promise, and now she answered him. With courage, faith, and strength, she delivered her petition. She started with courtesy, making it clear that she wasn't trying to tell him what to do, and saying, "If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king." Esther was very aware that the king might refuse her request, and so she was cautious and humble. And then with great tact, diplomacy, and wisdom, she told the king that her petition was, "Let my life be given at my petition and my people at my request." She asked the king to spare her life and to spare the life of her people. She did not just blurt out that there's a man in your kingdom who plans to destroy all the Jews. Rather, she appealed on a personal basis. And Esther's request was directed toward her husband's heart, that his queen was in jeopardy of losing her life. Esther asked for her life to be spared because she recognized that her fate was the same as theirs. She took Mordecai's challenge to heart when he had told her earlier, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews." Her life and the life of her people were inseparably joined. She believed that whatever happened to them would happen to her. The king was probably stunned and perplexed, and it surely took him a moment for this to register and make sense. Who were her people? Wasn't she a Persian? Why is her life in danger? Esther continued by stating that we are sold, which refers to the great bribe of silver that Haman had offered to the king in order to purchase the privilege of wiping out her people. When Haman convinced the king to allow the decree, he said, "If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries." This fact of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them had been relayed to Esther by Mordecai earlier. Esther told the king that she and her people had been sold to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. Esther used the language of Haman's decree here, which read, "And the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month." You see Mordecai's wisdom in sending Esther a copy of the actual decree, as it gave her petition more authority and weight when she was able to recount the words of that decree. And at this point, Esther revealed that she was a Jew, because the decree was for the overthrow and slaughter of all Jews. Concerning being sold, Esther added that if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, or if all this had just been a matter of her and her people being sold into slavery, she would not have said anything. But being sold for destruction and slaughter, she could not keep quiet. If there had been an edict that sold the Jews into slavery, this might have been changed later on down the road, but for her people to be annihilated, you can't undo that. So she had to say something. Esther added, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. The term countervail means compensate. And Esther added a subtle argument here, appealing to the good of Persia and the king's pocketbook. She was saying that whether they were sold into slavery or sold for destruction, by losing the Jews, the king was being financially damaged and losing a tremendous resource of money and taxes for his kingdom, injuring the king's revenue beyond the possibility of compensation. To lose the Jews also would have caused the king great damage, as in losing them and their services, he was losing a people who were a great resource and an industrious and productive asset to his empire, for which he could also never be fully compensated. The enemy that desired to destroy the Jews could never pay enough or ever approach the proper compensation for all that the Jews brought to the Persian Empire. Esther was again referring to Haman's bribe and was telling the king that even 10,000 talents or 750,000 pounds of silver could not be considered as compensation to the kingdom for the loss of a whole nation of people throughout all their generations. The king had blindly trusted Haman and not given his decree much attention, as Haman had presented it in such a way as a problem being solved for the good of the king and the kingdom, and the king believed Haman knew what he was doing. But Esther pointed out that the decree was actually to the king's damage, and it was in his best interest to do something about it. Hearing all this, the heart of the silent guest at this dinner must have failed, knowing that he brought an edict that required the murder of the Queen of Persia. Esther chapter 7 verses 5-7 reads, Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he, that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Esther's petition had a dramatic effect on King Ahasuerus. After Esther's request, the king answered and demanded to know who it was. Who was the enemy she spoke of, and where was he? This one who had dared to scheme such a diabolical thing in his heart. The king wanted to know who would he dare to destroy the queen, and who would dare to destroy her people. The words durst presume or dare presume in his heart, reflected the depths of the king's emotion here. It's hard to imagine that the king did not know or had entirely forgotten who had been responsible for this recently written and published decree for the entire empire. And Esther 3:15 states that the decree was given in Shushan the palace. So Ahasuerus might have asked his questions just to make sure. Even before he heard the name of the enemy from Esther, he might have already known. But it's also very possible that the king, in his preoccupied fog of being a king, had absolutely no clue who it was, and he trusted Haman implicitly. The queen had wisely invited Haman to the banquet for just this moment. After the king asked who it was, with no hesitation, Esther turned and looked at Haman. And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman." The king asked, "Who is he and where is he?" And she answered, "This wicked Haman, who was sitting right there with them at the banquet." The king's chief officer, the second in command of all Persia, was the adversary, the enemy, who had plotted the whole thing to destroy all the Jews. Esther revealed the truth about Haman, that he was not a trustworthy and loyal servant of the king, but that instead he was an adversary and an enemy, more concerned with his own interests than the benefit of the king or his kingdom. Haman was a wicked man who allowed his pride, hatred, rage, and desire for revenge to supersede his devotion to king and country. After being exposed for who and what he truly was before the most powerful man on the face of the earth, verse 6 states, "Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen." Haman was dumbfounded and terrified. In 24 hours, Haman's life progressed from honor at being the distinguished guest at Esther's first banquet to humiliation at having to honor Mordecai and parade him through Shushan, to then horror at being exposed by the queen as an adversary and an enemy by his decree to exterminate the people of the queen. At this point, verse 7 states, "And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden." The king was startled by the turn of events, and he was furious. Thus he stood up from the table and walked out to the palace garden. He needed some time to collect his thoughts before he acted. He was angry at being manipulated into this decree. But how could he now punish Haman for a decree that he personally approved and had given his ring to create and seal it? So he needed time to think. Warren Wiersbe put it well about what was behind his wrath. Ahasuerus was a man with a short temper, but on this occasion his anger must have been volcanic. His masculine pride was hurt because he had misjudged the character of Haman. He had made a fool of himself by promoting Haman and by giving him so much influence. The king had also erred in approving the decree without first weighing all the facts. As a result, he had endangered the lives of two very special Jews, Mordecai, who had saved his life, and Esther, his beloved wife. The king stood up, and Haman also stood. Seeing the king's reaction, watching him storm out from the banquet in anger, Haman knew that the king was no longer for him, and he was not in his good graces. Rather, the king was against him, and now Haman was in a precarious situation. Haman was experiencing the truths of Proverbs 16:14. The wrath of a king is as messengers of death. In Proverbs 19:12, the king's wrath is as the roaring of a lion. Haman found himself standing there with a difficult decision to make. He had three options available to him. He could try to follow the king into the garden to attempt to reason with him, but that wasn't a good option because he knew the king was angry and he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king, as verse 7 says. Second, he could try to flee the palace complex and citadel, but if he tried, he would probably be stopped, not make it far, or eventually be captured. So Haman turned to the third and best possibility left to him, the mercy of the queen. The evil that Haman saw that was determined against him was the doom of his death. Haman knew that an inescapable death sentence was likely coming. So he hoped Esther might show mercy and intercede for him before the king. So the man who condemned all Jews to die then made request for his life to a Jew, to Esther the queen, and he begged Esther for his life to be spared. When the king was for him, Haman strutted about like a peacock, proud, boastful, barking orders, treating others with hatred, malice, and cruelty. But now that the king was against him, this big man, so-called, suddenly became very small as he reacted with fear and cowardice and groveled at the feet of the queen. Esther chapter 7 verses 8 to 10 read, "Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified." As Haman begged Esther for his life to be spared, in the intensity of his pleading, he fell on the bed, or the couch on which Esther was reclining by the table for the banquet. The timing could not have been any worse for Haman. Just as he throws himself on that couch, the king walked back into the room where the banquet had been held, and he's shocked to find Haman lying on Esther's couch. The sight enraged the king. He viewed Haman's posture in the worst possible light, and he said, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? The king interpreted it as an assault on the queen. He saw it as an act of violence against Esther rather than a plea for mercy. And that was the final straw. Haman's fate was now sealed, and the king waited for no explanation. Thus verse 8 reads, As the word went out of the king's mouth. That word was the word to punish Haman with death, the word of execution. And as soon as the king said it, the king's servants covered Haman's face. This action was done because now he was a condemned criminal who was no longer worthy to look on the face of his king. Earlier, Haman had covered his own head because of his humiliation in having to honor Mordecai, but now his head and face were covered by others in preparation for his execution. Word had spread throughout Shushan quickly that day about the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai. This isn't hard to imagine, since this impalement stake was standing at 75 feet, 7.5 stories high, so all could see it in Shushan. In verse 9, Harbona, one of the chamberlains, is mentioned. This man is also mentioned in chapter 1, verse 10, as one of the members of the king's 7-man council that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king. Harbona advised the king to behold or look at the impalement stake, which was towering high over his city at Haman's home. Harbona explained to Ahasuerus that Haman had built it for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, or had done good for the king in saving his life. And that was the first that the king heard of Haman's plan to kill Mordecai. The death sentence had already been passed, but this was just confirmation that Haman was wicked, like Esther had said. This Jew, Mordecai, had saved the king's life in the past, and Haman wanted to kill not only Mordecai, but all the Jews. Charges were piling up against Haman. Whatever the king wanted was law. He was judge, jury, and executioner. Hearing this about Haman scheming against Mordecai and the gallows he had built for him, he told Harbona to hang him thereon. With great irony and by God's working in providence, Haman lost his life on the very instrument that he had enthusiastically prepared for the death of Mordecai, and now he was condemned to die there instead. Reminiscent of Haman, Psalm 7:14-16 reads, Behold, he travaileth with iniquity and hath conceived mischief. He made a pit and digged it, and has fallen into the ditch which he made. His mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealings shall come down upon his own pate or crown. The greatest example of this was when Satan thought he had won the victory by influencing the religious leaders and working through Judas and getting the crowd to cry out for Christ's crucifixion. But the cross turned out to be the instrument of Satan's defeat. On this day, Haman had paraded Mordecai through the streets of Shushan, and now he was paraded through the streets with his face covered and taken to the impalement stake at his house. And as commanded, they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Haman's body was pierced, impaled, and left there to hang on that 75-foot high gallows, and all of Shushan saw the fall and the end of Haman. The progression of Haman's life in the book of Esther was honored, humiliated, horrified, and hanged. And instead of Haman's wrath being pacified at the sight of Mordecai being hung on that gallows, it was the king's wrath that was pacified at Haman being hung on it. And as it's been correctly said, Haman, as the Jews' enemy, illustrates the ignominious end of the Antichrist, the last great foe of the Jewish people. As Haman almost succeeded in annihilating God's people, so also will the coming man of lawlessness. As Haman's end came by royal decree, so will the Antichrist by the word out of the mouth of the coming King of Kings.
For nearly 80 years, the Berean Bible Society has endeavored to encourage believers everywhere to study God's Word. With this foundation, the believer is equipped to grow spiritually and energized to effectively share the gospel. Through the tools of both traditional and electronic media, we are positioned to reach our world well into the coming generations. Streaming lessons, printed materials, audio teachings, and daily devotionals are all available at the BereanBibleSociety.org.
Thank you again for tuning in to Transformed by Grace. We appreciate your prayer support and the financial gifts. The purpose and mission of the Berean Bible Society is to help you understand the whole counsel of the Word of God. For more information, visit our website at www.BereanBibleSociety.org or give us a call at 262-255-4750. Or if you prefer, write us at the Berean Bible Society. Now until next time, may you be transformed by God's grace.